And now this is the most fascinating position in this entire problem. Believe it or not, white has 3 different ways to win, and all of them are very tricky to find. What's going on, guys? We're back with another problem composed by Mark Liburkin, and this guy has created some of the most fascinating problems that I've ever seen, and this one is no exception. The position on the board, it's white to play and win, and the idea behind how you win is absolutely stunning. So stick around, you're not going to want to miss this one. All right, so like I said, it's white to play and win. Now, before we even start analyzing this position, we have to make sure we understand one thing. A king, a knight, and a bishop against a lone king is able to win, okay? So what that means is if we are able to capture these pieces, and even if we lose the pawn in the process, it's still a win for white. Okay, so that's the first thing to kind of keep in the back of your mind. If you didn't know that, now you do know that. And if you want to learn how to do this checkmate, the king, the bishop, and the knight, there's another video on the channel. I'll link it below. You can watch that, and I teach you the process. It's a little bit involved, but it is a win for white. Now, the other thing to note is that if we have the knight and the bishop, but black has a king and a bishop, then we're not going to be able to win, right? It's hard enough to checkmate with just these pieces. If black has this extra bishop, it's going to be too difficult. Okay, so that's important to note, because if it was black's turn in this position, black could play the move g5, which puts us in check, and then it's forcing a pawn trade. Even if we're able to win the pawn later with our bishop and knight somehow, black's still going to have their bishop, and we're not going to be able to win, right? So this is kind of the first thing that we have to watch out for. And so the first move of this puzzle actually isn't super difficult. So if you want to pause and think through, I kind of gave you a big hint. What do you think the first move is? All right, well, if you had a chance to think through that and you said king to f7, you are correct. And actually, king to g8 will work as well, but either of these moves kind of accomplishes the same purpose, which is get out of that check so that black can't play g5 with check and force the pawn trade. Okay, so let's go with king f7. And now black plays the move king to g4. And this makes sense, right? Like they're trying to come here and take this pawn, because if they can take this pawn, and then even if we trade, that's not what we want. We're only going to have a bishop left, right? And once they take this pawn, the bishop is free, and we're not going to be able to win, okay? So if you want to think through here, I won't give you a hint on this one. What do you think our next move should be? Well, if you had a chance to look at that and you said bishop to d6, you are correct. Basically, we're just defending our pawn. We don't want to let the bishop take it, so we're adding another defender. We had 2 pieces attacking it, and now we have 2 defending it. Okay, now is where it starts to get really interesting. So black plays the move g5, and essentially they're saying, okay, well, I'm going to use my pawn now, and I'm going to take this, and then I'm still going to have my bishop, and you're only going to have your bishop and your knight. I'm going to have this pawn, and how are you going to win? So here's another moment where I'll let you think through, and what do you think we should play here? This one is a little bit more tricky, but I'm going to give you guys a chance to find it. Well, if you had a chance to look at that, the only move that wins for us is f5. And first of all, if you said captures, well then, like I mentioned, the bishop's going to take, and we have this situation where it's king, bishop, and knight against the king and a bishop. And we're not going to be able to checkmate. The bishop's going to be too annoying for us, and we're not going to be able to do what we need to do with the knight and the bishop and the king to force the king to the corner and checkmate him. So because of that, we have to play f5. Now, one interesting line that you may have considered is king to g6, saying, you know what if I sacrifice the pawn and go over here and take the bishop? So let's look at why this doesn't work. So if we play king g6, black's going to take the pawn, and yes, we are able to take the bishop, but black has this pawn now that we do have to deal with. And guess what? After f3, this guy is going to become a queen unless we can figure out a way to stop it with our knight and our bishop. Sorry, our knight and our bishop. Obviously, our king is too far to assist. We don't want to let the pawn take our knight, so we can try to move it somewhere, but where are we going to move it to, right? Anywhere we move it, it's going to go here and then here in the next 2 moves. And so, for example, let's say we tried c3, pawn's going to go to f2, and as you can see, the bishop can't stop it, and the knight can't stop it. Now, there's one interesting line, knight to d1. And this is very clever, because if black gets a queen, check it out, we've got this fork, right? And we're going to win now. But what do you think black can play in this position? Well, there's actually two moves. The simplest is kind of just to bring the king over like this. But the more interesting is to play f1 knight. And this is actually also going to be a draw. Again, the knight and the bishop are not going to be able to checkmate. So interesting little resource there for black. I just wanted to point out that line. So, but going all the way back here, that's why we can't abandon this pawn like this and just go immediately for the bishop, because we just don't have a way to stop it, right? So because of that, like I mentioned, the only move is f5. Okay, so now the obvious move for black is king takes f5, right? Our pawn is undefended. They just took it. Now they have a pawn and a bishop, and all we have is our knight and our bishop. And you're probably starting to wonder, how in the world are we going to win this game now that we just lost our pawn, right? So again, I invite you to pause if you would like. Think through, what do you think we should play here? There's only one correct move in this position. Well, if you had a chance to look at that, the only move that wins for white is knight to g3 check. And the reason is it's kind of not that readily apparent why, but we're putting the king in check, but in a particular way, right? That we're taking away this square. The bishop's taking away this square. The king's taking away these squares. And so we're forcing the king to go back here, okay? That's the only place the king can go to. So if we compare that to if we would have went check on d4, well, now the king can escape to e4 and the game is a draw, right? We're not going to be able to do anything. Black's going to just move their pawn. And actually, I should point out that we can go for this, try to trap the bishop, but black has this really nice idea, bishop f8. And the point is that if we take it, we're losing our knight, and if we, move the bishop or something, we're still losing our knight, or the bishop's going to escape, and it's a draw regardless, right? So that doesn't work. So that's why we have to, instead of knight to d4 check, we have to go knight to g3 check, like I said, to take away this square to force the king back to g4. Okay, king to g4, and now this is the most fascinating position in this entire problem. Believe it or not, white has 3 different ways to win, and all of them are very tricky to find. And so I'm going to give you a chance, pause the video, think through, how can white win? And like I said, there's 3 different ways to win. See if you can find at least one of those ideas. All right, so the 3 winning moves are: number 1, bishop to c7, number 2, king to g8, and number 3, knight to f1. Now, I want you to just pause for a moment and consider how different those 3 moves are. I mean, just look at that. Completely different moves, and yet all 3 of these moves win the game for white. Is that not mind-boggling? I mean, like, when I first saw this and I saw that these were the 3 winning moves, I was like, you got to be kidding me. Like, this is amazing, right? And it's interesting to point out that it's these exact 3 moves. So bishop b8 is not the same as bishop c7, or bishop e5 is not the same as bishop c7. It has to be bishop c7. And this king move, king to g8, has to be king to g8. It can't be king g6. It can't be, anywhere else. And then again, knight f1 has to be knight f1. It can't be some other knight move, right? Amazing stuff. So let's talk about why these 3 moves, 1, 2, and 3, are the winning moves in this position. All right, so let's start with bishop to c7. So why is this a winning move for white? Well, first of all, it has to do with the fact that we're putting the ball back in black's court, and we're saying, okay, you have to make a move. What are you going to move? Well, first of all, the pawn is blocked, so the pawn can't move. Second of all, the bishop doesn't really want to move here because we just take it, right? So king move. Okay, where can the king move to? Well, we're controlling these squares, and we're controlling these squares, which means only options for the king are to go to one of these 3 squares. Now, if it moves forward to one of these 2, let's start with that first, we're going to play knight to f5 and trap the bishop. Okay, so remember, bishop can't move or it's getting trapped. Now, black does have this pawn, and if you remember from one of the previous lines, sometimes the pawn can just go and get a queen and we can't stop it. So let's see what happens. If it pushes, we take the bishop, it pushes again. We can actually play a number of different moves here, but let's just go with king f6. Pawn can push, and now bishop to b6, blocking the pawn and preventing the king from assisting, right? And so the king can try to come around, but we play knight f5. When it tries to come around, we have knight to g3 check. And look at this really nice maneuver with the knight and the bishop, keeping the king away from the pawn. King has to go over here, and we simply bring the king up, and, black just can't do anything, right? So that's kind of the idea. Is that, in this position, the pawn is not far enough advanced and our knight and our bishop can stop it, okay? So going back here, instead of a king move like this, you might say, well, what about king to h4? right? Because now when we play knight to f5 check, black can play king to h5 and defend their bishop, right? And this is another moment in the game which is pretty fascinating. So again, I invite you to pause. What do you think the winning idea is for white from this position? Well, if you had a chance to look at that, the winning move is bishop to d8. Now, what in the world is going on here? Essentially, what this move is doing is stopping this pawn from moving forward. You say, well, no, it's not. You can just move it. The problem is if it moves forward, it unleashes the bishop. It also blockades this square so that now knight to g3 is just checkmate, just like that. Look at that. I mean, is that not amazing? So because of that checkmate threat, the pawn can't move. But what else can black move? If they move the bishop, guess what? It's just getting captured. They can't move the king here. They can move the king here, but guess what? We're also just capturing the bishop. And so essentially, it's zugzwang, and black has no moves. It's just they're either getting mated or they're losing their bishop, right? Even though they have all these pieces, they're just jammed up in this weird way, and they can't do anything. It's absolutely fascinating, okay? So that's the idea. That's the winning idea. Now, you might be wondering, well, hold on a second. This was only after bishop c7, right? What happens after all those other moves? Well, first of all, let me point out, the reason bishop c7 was important was because if we went to like b8, remember how the very final move was bishop to d8? We couldn't do that if our bishop's over here, right? So that's one point. And if we come closer, you might be thinking, well, isn't this good enough, right? Let's look at what happens here. King to f3. We bring the knight in to try to trap the bishop like we did before. And now check it out. King to e4 can happen with a double attack on our pieces, right? Remember before the bishop was safe on c7. So very, very subtle things that make bishop c7 the only bishop move that wins. Now, let's go ahead and jump to king to g8. Why is king to g8 another way to win? Well, it's kind of doing the same thing, right? We're putting the ball back in black's court saying, okay, where are you going to move to? And notice how the king is still eyeing these squares from the bishop, right? On f7, it was doing the same thing. And on g8, it's doing the same thing. So bishop is trapped. Okay, so what's black going to do? Well, they can't move the pawn. Again, they have to make a king move. And this we've seen before, right? The knight comes in, the bishop is trapped. You know how that one ends. The pawn can try to push, but it's not going to make it, right? And so black's best chance is to go to h4, right? We go check. The king comes up to try to defend the bishop. And now, if you'd like to pause, what's the move that we can play in this position? Well, if you had a chance to look at that, the only winning move here is king to h7. Now, if you were tempted to say something like bishop e7, right, going with the same idea, now it's not the same, because now when black plays g4, our king's out of place. It's not actually checkmate, right, because the king can get away. And so you have to kind of change it up, and that's why the move here is king to h7. But this time, the idea is simply that we're going for the bishop. We're not actually going for checkmate now. So for example, after g4, we're going to take this bishop. And again, black has the problem that the pawn is not going to be able to go, and they can try, but it's not going to happen. We use our knight, we create this blockade, and black can't do anything, right? So a different idea, but kind of similar, right? So going back here, bishop c7, the point was that we wanted to set that checkmate trap with bishop to d8. Here, king g8 was the point. We just want to go over here and trap the bishop, right? Now, some of you are probably wondering, why do we have to go to g8 instead of g6? Like, it looks like g6 is kind of more obvious, just directly go for the bishop, right? Let's see what's wrong with this move. So on king to g6, black has a little tactical idea, and I'm going to let you guys see if you can find this one, but what can black play to save the position? Well, if you had a chance to look at that and said bishop to f8, you are correct. The point is that the king is still attacking our knight, and so black can do this little trick, sacrificing the bishop, taking our knight, and now they're going to get a draw. So now you can see why king g8 was the move, because we really needed our king to be trapping the bishop, not necessarily our bishop in that scenario, because we needed the bishop to guard the knight. Okay, cool. So we've looked at bishop c7, we've looked at king to g8, and now what's going on with knight to f1? Like, how in the world can this also win the game, right? So let's see what's going on with knight f1. Well, first of all, black has the kind of the same problem. Can't move the pawn, can't move the bishop or it gets taken. So they have to make a king move. Now, in this case, they have you know, some more options that they can move here. They can move here if they want. They couldn't do that before when our knight was there. So let's see what happens, first of all, if they go to f5. What is our plan? How are we going to win this? Well, now we have this idea of knight to e3 check, and we're taking away this square from the king this time. Bishop's taking away this, king's taking, so we're forcing the king over here. And it's weird because earlier when we played knight, knight to d4 check was the wrong move, allowing the king out, but now knight to e3 check is the right move. And once the king goes over here, we go knight to g4, again trapping the bishop. The pawn is not far enough, and we win that way. Okay, so that's one idea. The other idea, if the king goes to h5, trying to defend the bishop, we have a really stunning move. And I'll let you guys, again, if you want to pause, I know I'm giving you lots of chances. This is just such a mind-boggling problem that I just want to give you a chance. What do you think we should play now? And if you had a chance to look at that, the move is bishop to e7. And this time we are setting the trap again of that checkmate, right? The same idea that we saw before. If the pawn pushes, boom, there's the checkmate because the bishop is cutting off the diagonal. So again, same kind of thing. We're forcing the king to move. And then after it moves, it doesn't really matter where. We bring the king up, trap the bishop. Our knight is safe, right? So the bishop can't do that little tactic. Remember last time when our knight was here, it could, because now we can just take it and our knight is fine. So 3 different ways to win this position from let's see, let me go back, where was it? So after f5, okay, king takes, knight to g3 check, king g4, 3 different ways to win. 1, 2, and 3. Those are the only 3 moves that win. I'll put a link to the position if you want to play around with it. Check it out in the description. You can see for yourself that this is indeed the only way to win these 3 moves. But truly mind-boggling. This is a good example of like just how amazing chess is. You hardly have any pieces on the board, and you've got all this stuff going on. Cool checkmates, trapped bishops, catching a pawn with your knight and a bishop in a cool way. So many interesting things. Really, really cool. I hope you guys enjoyed this one as much as I did, and I'll see you next time. Stay sharp, play smart, and take care.